button. Okay.
Marnie, that was a sigh.
I think it was called a heavy sigh.
That was a sigh. I felt that. I felt that.
I think we all need a few breaths. So where is Jenny? I think we have a couple more people coming into our room that will be pushed here in a moment. Jenny's taking notes tonight. So we have a lot of data about these Ds. Would you like to talk about the Ds and choose one? Would we like to continue the conversation that we were having in the big room? We wanted to make sure everyone had a voice and not everybody feels comfortable speaking in the big room. Yes, Micah.
One thing, Megan posted a letter from the Bridger PTA, and since we have a Bridger parent here, I was trying to read it, get dinner ready, and all the thing at the same time. So I couldn't get through that. So I don't know if Andy, if that letter really affects what we're heading towards here. So I don't know if Andy wants to give like a comment, just like synopsis.
Yeah, I've kind of intentionally. I mean, I've observed that coming together. I've tried to. I feel like I'm playing a weird role where I'm sort of part of Bridger, but also want to not be. But so anyway, but yes, I'm familiar with the letter. I think to the extent it affects what we're doing here, the community feels, well, I mean, what that letter says is, one, the community feels really strongly about the two dual language strands staying together. So like in a lot of these proposals, I know it's kind of vague, and this is something Beth mentioned in her co-chair corner. It assumes, at least in the situation where we have a co-located Spanish program at Arleta, that some of the Bridger DLI students would go to Arleta and some would go to Lent. You know, Bridger would prefer that they go to all one place, to the same place, right? So could be another potential benefit of this idea of a whole school model at Lent that that we're talking about, because then Bridger could go to both Bridger strands would go to Lent. So that's one big thing. And the other one was feeling strongly that the Spanish DLI should be consolidated at Kellogg at the middle school level. There are some other things, but those are the two most relevant ones, I think, for what we're talking about.
I think with that said, oh, sorry, Alyssa. How about you go, since you raised your hand?
I don't really care that much who goes, so I'm sorry. I actually don't, my computer's not set up right, so I'm sorry who said that, and I can't see you. I have a question about the whole school DLI, Spanish DLI at Lent. So I'm forming an opinion about it, so I don't have strong feelings one way or the other at this moment. But one thing I have that first came to me was like, if the neighborhood kids don't want to be in Spanish, where do those neighborhood children go? And maybe I'm missing something really obvious, so I'm sorry if I am.
I am not sure if there is a district person in here. I can't see who all the participants are, but I can ask that question, and maybe if you'd like me to pop out and grab Judy or Esther, we can definitely grab it. I'm not on the chat, Marnie. I don't know if you are, but that's a really good question.
Well, how about we just table that for right now, and we'll ask one of them to come in.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'll go then. I think in talking and listening to Beth and in reading the Bridger letter, it makes sense to do, and in this push for whole DLI, it makes sense to do Lent whole DLI. And then looking at the feedback from the teachers from Lent that is found in the drive that says that they would be okay with being whole DLI. I'm wondering if keeping Lent a whole DLI would be a great tool for analysis of how whole DLI with co-located works. And knowing that Atkinson is doing a good job in mitigating the achievement gap, then I'm wondering if they can partner up in supporting Lent become whole DLI. And then it makes sense for the Bridger two strands to go to Lent if they want to stay together then. And then that makes it so we have two programs, one in inner Southeast and one in outer Southeast as well. So there's two possibilities for individuals to be able to access, like it doesn't limit access as well for other families that live in various locations. So I'm really digging, like Beth brought up that idea, and I'm kind of really digging it. And it also keeps Woodstock as co-located. But we also get the opportunity to figure out if whole DLI co-located for Spanish DLI makes sense, and then we'll be able to move forward in that. I don't think personally I have a preference in where we end up for Kellogg, if it's a Franklin or Harrison Park. If I would, it's clear that for students to have more class choices, they do need to have a DLI program focus in a middle school, and all the middle schools need to feed to that specific school. So that is the one thing that that I'm focused on. I'm not sure if it matters the location of Harrison Park or Kellogg to me at this time. So yeah.
Thanks, Martha.
Yeah. It would make more sense Kellogg because Franklin High School is right there for the Spanish DLI. But logistically and distance-wise, that's the one that makes more sense. But you know, I think that's in the details. Yeah.
I think to build on that, yeah, I mean, I think the trade-off that I saw in the scenarios when you talk about the location of the middle school Spanish DLI is if you consolidate the middle school Spanish DLI at Kellogg, this gets to the point of someone who talked about trying to look at the impact on neighborhood students. There's so little space left over that, in one, there's a lot fewer students in that immediate surrounding area around Kellogg in neighborhood programs who will be able to access the school. And then the other effect, and this is not a pro or con, it's just a trade-off, right, is that if you put the Spanish at Kellogg, the only way to get enough students for Harrison Park is to do some pretty geographically wonky stuff. Like basically you have to have Atkinson's neighborhood feed to Harrison Park, which, you know, we can discuss whether we feel okay about that, but that's just on a map, that's a little bit weird, right? And I think at least in Atkinson's current boundary, you have the situation where like between that and Bridger at CSS, like literally nobody in South Tabor would be going to the middle school that's right in South Tabor unless they're in Spanish DLI, which is a little bit weird. So not a reason not to do it, but you know, would be something to. I think there's a trade-off between the location at Kellogg and how strongly we feel about kind of geographically coherent boundaries and the ability of folks in the immediate area of Kellogg to neighborhood students to access the school. That's what I noticed.
Can we have your question one more time? And Claire is here joining us to answer.
Are you talking to me? Sorry, I have a rogue 9-year-old who you may hear and see without a shirt on. He does have pants on. My question was if we, as we're considering whole school Spanish DLI at Lentz, what happens to the neighborhood kids who do not want to, either can't or do not want to be in Spanish DLI? I have a lot of concerns about that actually, and I feel like this is a non-starter until I hear what happens to those kids.
So whenever there is a whole school program, there's always and for students that live in that neighborhood that don't want to be in that program, they have a neighborhood school identified for that area. And you know, it would be a school that is, you know, right the next one over most likely, you know, but we would also look at so that there'd be like a continuous boundary for that neighborhood. But the piece is the really looking at that when we're trying to balance the enrollment numbers. After we place programs, that could be a consideration. We know we need to consider that. And then we would look at where we need additional students. And because sometimes, the school might have 3 or 4 neighboring schools. So it just depends on what the proposal is at the end and where there's, what's the closest neighborhood school that would help balance the enrollment.
Sarah asked, does that mean probably Marysville or Kelly?
I don't have a map open in front of me, but yes, Marysville is what I would think is close, and I'd have to look to see if Kelly is connected to Lent. So let me get that out.
I think this actually happened in either
Three-
proposal A or B, and it was Marysville. I remember, but yeah.
Kelly is close, is next to Lent, but it's divided by Foster. So
Yeah.
Yeah, Marysville is what would come to mind for me, but at the same time, I wouldn't want to, I'm not trying to make a decision here right now. I'm just trying to say how it would work. So, yeah.
So basically, nobody who you're never going to be obligated to participate in a dual language program. If you don't want to, you're going to have a guaranteed neighborhood.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that those programs are, I think what I'm a little bit concerned about is I feel like we're taking a neighborhood school that is one of the probably more disadvantaged or higher percentage of socioeconomic, like lower socioeconomic status. And I don't feel like they've been very well represented in this process necessarily either. And we're talking about converting their whole school to a focus option essentially. And I just want to make sure that I mean, maybe that's well received and fine, and that's great and good, but I just have some concerns about that piece of it, these children that are not necessarily very well represented.
So I'm just looking at the current, also between Kelly and Marysville, the number of students at Marysville, it would tend to lean towards going there rather than Kelly, which has a much higher enrollment.
Beth, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I just had a logistical question for the neighborhoods that would be changing middle schools or middle school assignment. So currently right now, students that are in 6th grade, obviously that wouldn't be implemented next year for 7th grade, but it would be for 8th. So do they get grandfathered in and they get to stay in that middle school, or are the 8th graders transitioning to the new assignment?
Jenny or Claire, would you know that answer?
Jenny has her hand up.
Oh, that was for a different question. I'm sorry. I was trying to calculate some capacities at Lent with 3 strands. I didn't hear the question.
Would you mind repeating it, Beth?
Sure. For the folks that are changing middle school assignments, specifically for the neighborhood program, the students that are currently in 6th grade, they will be changing in 8th grade. Will the new assignment be the 8th graders will go to the new assignment, or they will maintain the school that they've been in and they will stay at that middle school? I didn't know how you all modeled it.
It is that they are assumed to be going into their new path. It doesn't look at policies of current 5th graders, would stay until the following year, because we're looking 5 years out, right, in the 2025. So those kids are already in those schools. Right, so if they're a 5th grader now, we're looking 5 years out, so they would actually then be in high school.
I'm looking at the 6th graders now. So the kids that are already in middle school now, this doesn't get implemented in 7th grade. It doesn't get implemented in 7th grade. It will be implemented in 8th grade. So are we moving the 8th graders to a new school, or do they get to finish
It
out middle
depends on
school?
if they're in a DLI program or a focus option program, they would move.
Just neighborhood is what I'm talking about.
Pardon me?
Just neighborhood is what I'm, just the neighborhood.
So that would be a recommendation the Southeast Guiding Coalition can make, is that, eighth graders would finish their final year in the same school. Fifth graders, another recommendation, and this is common. Fifth graders could remain in their school and finish out. The ones that are in their last year to just be allowed to finish out. That is a common recommendation in neighborhood programs.
Okay. I'm asking because it was something that was part of phase one, is that knowing that the boundaries were shifting, it was an agreement and the Guiding Coalition recommended it, and it was said that those students would be able to finish out those 3 years regardless of what changed. And I didn't know, now that we're shifting programs and a lot more, I didn't know if that was still going to be honored or that is up for grabs as well.
So that's something the Southeast Guiding Coalition would want to include in their recommendation.
Okay, Alyssa, I'm looking at the notes from the drive from the teachers and staff notes from the listening session from December 9th. And Claire Hertz was the facilitator with John Lyons as the note taker. I put the link on the chat. And the first thing that shows there, and I know you're concerned for the Lents, is that the teachers at Lents support a full DLI program. Okay, so I think that speaks a little bit to why the proposal that Beth had makes a little bit more sense in my brain, because I was reviewing those notes earlier this week and I noticed that as a point. So it makes me lean towards the Beth proposal a little bit more because of the notes that I reviewed. I hope that's helpful.
I also want to make sure Maya's voice is heard in the chat. She said that, Alyssa, those are really good points. And also traveling from the Lent neighborhood to Marysville is crossing 82nd and possibly the freeway. And make sure that's in here.
I have actually a clarifying question that I just wanted to point out, is that what I heard Beth say, and Andy, I think you've been in those conversations, and correct me if I'm wrong, so I'm trying to take notes and add up numbers on the side and capture stuff, is that both of the Bridger strands would go to Lent, creating 3 strands, but that wouldn't necessarily remove the neighborhood program portion from Lent. So just curious about this room and what we're feeling. I know, Alyssa, you had some concerns about that, but are we talking about consolidating those 3 strands at Lent, or are we talking about turning Lent into a whole school Spanish DLI? Okay, I just want to make sure when we report back, because that's what I'm hearing you say, Martha, and that's what I'm hearing, but I wanted to make sure.
I think what I heard from Beth is that turn Lent into a whole DLI model. So then that limits the 2 sites for 2 sites due to staffing issues from what Judy mentioned last week. And it also supports the testing of a whole DLI model for Spanish. And it keeps Atkinson as is, just because they are mitigating the achievement gap, which could be helpful for support for whole school DLI at Lent.
And does that also keeps the 2 Bridger strands together, right?
Yeah, and that keeps the 2 Bridger starts together, which is what they request on the letter. Yeah.
Okay, we are tasked with talking about the Ds, but let's first take a vote just in the chat. We'll go 0 to 5. Again, it's the 0 is not in support at all, and 5 is 100%. So, and usually 3 is about not in support. Okay, so this is the verbiage. Would you like to see a model of co-locator Mandarin and whole school Spanish at elementary school, assuming consolidated programs at middle school?
I'm sorry, that was a loaded question. Can you say that again or put it in the chat or something?
Sure.
What?
Just like asking about Beth's proposal, I think.
I recognize all of these words independently. So let's see if you would like to see a model of co-located Mandarin and whole school Spanish at the elementary school level. And then assuming that those consolidated programs happen at middle school. Yeah, that is what Beth was talking about. It isn't that it's whole school at middle school, but that it's consolidated there.
So 0 to 5 on how comfortable we are with that idea at
Yes,
this point.
because the Ds are not considering whole.
Right.
And we have until 7:32, so we have almost 10 minutes left in here. Okay, so there's 3s in here. What, Kathy, would you feel comfortable speaking to your 3?
Yeah, I think the 3 is, I mean, I'd be open to seeing it. I'm not really convinced yet that it would work. For a couple of my things that I'm concerned about are 3 strands of the neighborhood schools, and just how the transportation. Marysville would be wonderful. We'd love to have it, but I know that is a really long distance crossing 205, especially for those communities for events. I mean, we'd have busing, but although we did hear how transportation is a little tricky, but I'm just thinking for families to really feel connected to a school is that far away. So it's our farthest neighborhood school right now is Lent to the east, and then asking families to travel that distance back west. So that's just a concern I have about making that particular location a whole school DLI.
And how about Sarah? You also have a 3.
Yeah, I mean, I'm totally interested in the idea of a whole school Spanish DLI. My concerns are completely based around what Kathy was basically saying, and Alyssa has alluded to, the Lent neighborhood kids. I just feel like that's already an underserved population, and I would really want to know how we were going to mitigate the negative impacts on that particular group of kids, because Lent to Marysville is not easy. I mean, it's you can see it geographically, but also just, living in this zone, like that's a really rough area to cut through. It's more than just like, oh, there's a freeway, oh, there's Foster, it's really a complex area. So that's my 3-4. I'd still like to see it though.
Okay, so we'd like to see it modeled. Let's see, there was another 3. Alyssa. Same.
I don't have anything new to add.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so would the model help though? Would you like to see, and is that an option, Jenny?
Yeah, it is an option.
So would that help? Would you like to talk about the Ds as well? Do you want to look at those and see what those are, or is the whole school stopping us from talking about the Ds?
I don't think it affects the Ds at all for the most part. Shouldn't affect the whole school, right?
Okay.
Talk about the Ds.
Talk about the Ds. We have a
lot to decide in the Ds.
quick bit to talk about the Ds. And see, how would you like to go through this? Were you paying attention enough? Can we vote on each one? Can we do a 0 to 5 in the chat again for each one without going over them? Do you feel confident enough?
I think we should at least read the headline of which each is. Although I'm curious if anyone has any, I mentioned sort of what I observed about the trade-off with Spanish at Kellogg. Was there anything just in general that jumped out to anyone else about just sort of some of the considerations here? I'm happy with proposal 2, but I'm just curious.
Is that D1 you're talking about, or 2?
Kellogg is in D1 and D2 as the Spanish DLI. Oh, yes. Columbia Room has a nice little summary. I keep sneaking over that. So yeah, so it's basically, thinking about where to consolidate the programs at the high school level. And depending on, where the programs go and what the feeders look like, it could potentially influence that, but it does, seem like it's either Kellogg or Harrison Park in terms of Spanish. And then potentially, we have Hosford, Chinese DLI at Hosford. As well. So I could see having the co-located Mandarin programs stay as they are, looking at then consolidating into a whole school Spanish DLI, and then seeing what that does on whether it would better support Kellogg or Harrison Park. So there may be some feeder changes depending on what the forecasted look like if we did go to a whole school for Lent.
All right, recognizing that we have about 4 minutes, would you feel comfortable doing a vote on each one and just to get a pulse so that the school can have that going back? Don't feel comfortable, Alyssa? Anyone else understand these enough? Okay. How about let's spend 5 minutes on one of them or two, the D1 and D2. Are those the ones that we're talking about with Kellogg? Or did any of them stand out to you when you heard Jed describing them that you thought, oh, that's fantastic?
Could I chime in here?
Yes, please.
When I looked at this earlier today or yesterday, and it seems D4, at least from a numbers perspective, it seems to equal, it seems the most equalized in terms of displacement of students and just all the other metrics. So that was just what popped out at me in terms of D4. There's no one school that's under enrolled. There's no one school that's way over enrolled, and it seems like the least amount of change as well, and it may work out.
I mean, you're relocating Spanish from Kellogg.
Right. I mean, there are some. I didn't look at really defined detail. What would be the big barrier blocks, but in terms of from a numbers perspective, that's what popped out at me.
I don't get the rationale for consolidating Mandarin at Hosford personally. I would want an explanation for that. But I mean, I agree with you on the numbers, but I have some equity concerns about that one.
Yeah, I find D4 really strange in terms of the Chinese at Hosford, and it really under enrolls Kellogg. It takes Kellogg from being super full to being like in the 50s, doesn't it?
And it's moving the program for, yeah.
And there's no DLI there.
You could
like
fix
at all.
the weird feeder thing though. I feel like that, but yeah, it is weird. It's very weird.
It's weird, but if it's one of those things, hey, could we work around that to make it work? Right. Instead of, for me, 4 different proposals, that's for me a lot to absorb. But so I look at kind of, hey, where do I start on this? This is my process.
Okay, we just have about another minute. Alyssa, you have your hand up.
I just sometimes find it easier to have like Jenny or Claire, like the experts, the educational and data experts, give us like, what is your recommendation? It like helps me narrow it down a little bit, because all 4 of these have pluses and minuses in my opinion. So I'm having a really hard time being like, I don't actually know what's the best.
We take our cues from you, so now that's why we have 4.
All right, we just have another minute before we head back in. Jenny, do you feel comfortable sharing out?
Sure.
Okay.
Anyone feel happy to jump in as well if I don't capture the specific thoughts?
Yeah, would you like more time to absorb the Ds before we and talk about them again? Is that what you would like as a group? Yes, head nods. Okay. Okay, it's a lot. And in the Miro board, there is the middle school assignments are all here with areas to add notes if you think of ideas at 3
Can I
o'clock in the morning.
say that after this, I think we should all have a glass of wine or something like that. Unless you're doing dry January and you don't drink alcohol, then a nice kombucha or a cup of tea for you. But
Try January. So I'm happy to stay if you would like to continue talking. And also, please manage your energy and feel free to take a break. Assuming with your cameras on, you'd like to continue talking. How about if I share screen? And would you like to look at the Ds again? It's probably tiny.
One of my threshold questions here is still understanding, because I think I heard, I don't remember if this was in an SEGC meeting or somewhere else. I heard from a principal what sounded like a pretty compelling argument, like programmatic argument, for why Spanish should be consolidated to Kellogg or should remain at Kellogg, or why it would be really hard to recreate that program at this point somewhere else. And so I feel like one way to narrow this down in my mind is deciding, okay, are we keeping the Spanish program at Kellogg, or are we even open to relocating to Harrison Park? And then I think the companion question to that is what I raised before, which is, how do we feel about the trade-off between keeping Spanish at Harrison Park and doing something pretty geographically wonky, like having Atkinson's neighborhood feed to Harrison Park, in order to, that would be the trade-off, right? So like, which do we feel more strongly about? I feel like there's a couple of questions in there, like just on general principles, that would probably help us narrow some of this stuff down.
I'm just gonna butt in and say I totally agree with you, Andy, because that's the, like, do we want whole school at the elementary level? Because there's going to be potential impacts to the middle schools that we're not exactly sure about yet, unless we look at, like, the whole models right now. And whether or not the feeder patterns for Kellogg or Harrison Park, I mean, this SEGC process, as you know, is focused on Harrison Park, but the prior one was focused on Kellogg. So I think you have a really good point of where those trade-offs need to be at this point in time. And I think it'd be interesting to dive into that a little more to hear where people's pulse is. Because there's some stuff we can do with boundaries, but you're right, it may get a little geographically funky, potentially.
Beth, your hand up.
Yeah, I think on the other side, not talking about Spanish DLI, but the Chinese DLI, option 1 puts Woodstock and Harrison Park, which is a pretty significant lift for that school. Option 4 puts Harrison Park at Hofford, which is complete opposite. And then option 2 puts Harrison Park at Lane. So I'm just trying to figure out like what the right answer is for Chinese DLI as well, if they're consolidated at middle school, because I don't know if it's what kind of a lift it is for Harrison Park to go to Lane, but the other two, Hossford and Harrison Park, seem to be the extreme sides. And I just thought, we're talking a lot about Spanish DLI. I thought there's another program we need to consider too.
Does anyone have strong feelings about that? How about the folks who are in those neighborhoods? Are you in those neighborhoods, or do you know folks in those neighborhoods, and how would they feel being moved?
I'll just say, as being the Hossford principal, I agree with what Beth said, that's a big hop. And I think back to when specifically the Woodstock program was talking about, when in earlier scenarios about the DLI program moving in especially like environmental impact of having to travel that far, it's just a big hop. So I think that needs some consideration.
Joe, do you mean that it's a big hop for the Harrison Park strand? Or who do you mean it's a big hop for? Could you just explain that a little bit more?
Just like if you have kids that are going from Woodstock to then Harrison Park more.
And what about the Harrison Park kids? I mean, everywhere is kind of a big hop for them.
Yeah, I think that was what Beth was getting at, where one way or the other, if you're looking at those two sites, it's just far for someone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think, Lane seems like a reasonable
Yeah.
lift for Woodstock. Kellogg seems maybe a good combination for both Woodstock and Harrison Park, but then that pushes Spanish DLI out. So I feel like Kellogg is that centerpiece for both Chinese DLI and Spanish DLI, and we're gonna impact one of those groups greatly if we consolidate.
For what it's worth, I've heard from the Harrison Park rep that they feel that Lane is, that Lane feels too far for that community, for what it's worth. I forget which D that is, but yeah.
I think that was 2. So
Yeah.
1 seems like a big lift for Woodstock, 2 seems like a problem for Harrison Park, and 4 seems like a problem for Harrison Park. So 3
Yeah.
puts it at Kellogg, but then that pushes Spanish DLI out, which is also
Yeah.
an issue. So
With the Woodstock Harrison Park thing too, I think there's a question of like, well, if everything else were okay, for example, out consolidating in Harrison Park, like who are we okay putting the burden on in that situation? Those are two actually quite socioeconomically different communities. But I agree with you that there's other issues that I have with D1, but I think there's a question of who bears the burden here, right? And like, who are we trying to prioritize if we have to make access relatively easier or harder for certain communities? Like, who do we prioritize? But yeah.
Andy, just to expand on that, I mean, I kind of feel like it's really far for Harrison Park to go to Hosford if we're talking about Chinese DLI, and that's a big burden. So I feel there's very few things that I feel are clear here, but that seems like pretty far to ask Harrison Park families to travel into Hosford to go to Mandarin immersion to me.
I mean, this is why I kind of like 3, even though I'm surprised to hear myself say it as a phase 1 veteran. This idea was floated and was not popular. That this is the one that would have Mandarin at Kellogg and Spanish at Harrison Park. But I mean, if you look both at the numbers in terms of like robust enrollment at Harrison Park and pretty good at Lane, it's not overcrowded. It's a more central location for Mandarin. I think again, what you see here when Spanish is at Harrison Park is that Spanish just gives Harrison Park a lot more margin for error on the enrollment. With Mandarin there, they can't afford much attrition before you're getting pretty close to the 500 mark. So I don't have a solid opinion, but I'm just I was surprised at how well that one worked out, because philosophically that's not my favorite, but there seems to be like one.
3 is the one that I highlighted as well. But then again, it's a big question for the Spanish DLI. And Andy, I heard also the principal saying that it's been a big lift to make that school focus on Spanish, and then it would be a big lift to change it. So
I think we need to hear from them on that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a big question. That's the one I highlighted.
I would like to speak about this for just a minute, because one of the things that happens if you move Spanish DLI out of Kellogg, they have hired a lot of bilingual staff into that school. And the way our staffing process works in following, working with the teachers union and the contract that's in place, we would not be able to control keeping all the Spanish people together, because there's a seniority component and licensure component. There's a whole series of things that have to happen. So I was trying not to say anything, but some of you asked for a staff opinion, and that's what I struggle with D3 on, is that it would be very hard to gather all the Spanish people together in a new school.
That's exactly what I want to hear, Claire, even if it's not, because I think this is what's tough, right? Because I've heard that, and if that is the answer, if that's the consensus, it's tough because I think if we were just starting from scratch, I think there's a lot about having the Spanish program at Harrison Park that solves some problems just from a numbers standpoint. But these aren't just numbers, right? And so the fact that we're working from a program that's established at Kellogg that we couldn't necessarily just pick up and move, I think we just have, that's what I mean. Like, I wonder if we just have to treat that as a given, even if it's not going to give us an ideal solution. And then it's like, how do we mitigate? Is there any way to mitigate some of this like that? I just can't get, that Atkinson to all the Atkinson boundary to Harrison Park is just so weird to me. I need to find a way to feel better about that. But yeah, thank you. So that's exactly what I want to hear.
So I'm going to say one other thing on D2, where Spanish days at Kellogg and Chinese would be at Lane. We don't have to move the Russian immersion to Harrison Park. So that was something the instructional folks told you at the last meeting. So if that helps, I don't know if that's one of the things people are concerned about with D2, but I just wanted to share that as a possibility.
Andy, just to let you know, oh, sorry, my camera is off. That's something that we talked about the Atkinson neighborhood possibly going to Harrison Park. And some parents are not happy about that. But we also then mentioned the reality that there's hardship transfers that is possible for students that live like across the street from Kellogg, that they can apply to be part of that Kellogg neighborhood too as well. So that's something that's been floated around the neighborhood community as well already, as a possible reality.
Okay, I think we need more time to talk about this. Beth, you have 10 seconds?
I just wondered what would happen if we didn't consolidate Chinese DLI at the middle school. Just throw it out there, 3 seconds.